On this channel, we've covered many box office bombs, and there's always a few factors that are consistent among the flops. Usually they have big spectacle with expensive special effects, or maybe they might take place in a far-off interesting world. Not to mention, they almost always have the intention of kicking off their own blockbuster franchise. However, the topic of today's video stands out, as it doesn't have any of those things, and is in fact a pretty low-key romantic comedy. But this rom-com still managed to lose upwards of $100 million. So join me today as we take a look at 2010's How Do You Know? We'll explore the production history, find out why it failed, and I'll offer up some of my own thoughts on the project. How Do You Know was written and directed by James L. Brooks, who is the co-creator of sitcoms such as The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Taxi, The Simpsons, as well as being the director behind films such as Terms of Endearment, Broadcast News, and As Good as It Gets. He came up with the idea of How Do You Know way back in 2005, after wanting to create a film about a young female athlete. The project landed with Columbia Pictures, and casting went underway in late 2008. Reese Witherspoon would be playing the lead of Lisa, Owen Wilson would be portraying the love interest Maddie, and Paul Rudd was cast as the other love interest, George. Originally, Bill Murray was in talks to play George's dad, Charles. However, he passed on the role. The role would end up with Jack Nicholson instead, who had worked with Brooks before on As Good as It Gets. Filming would kick off in June of 2009 and wrap in November of the same year, shooting primarily in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. By the end of production, the budget was reported to be a shocking $120 million. Yes, you heard that right, $120 million for a rom-com. This made it one of the most expensive rom-coms of all time, and you wouldn't be able to tell that from watching it, as there's no crazy set pieces or spectacle on the screen. So, what gives? Well, almost half that budget went to the cast and director's salary. Reportedly, Reese Witherspoon was paid $15 million, Jack Nicholson was paid $12 million, Owen Wilson was paid $10 million, Paul Rudd was paid $3 million, and James L. Brooks was paid $10 million. That is $50 million right there. To put that into perspective, you can make 5 Ladybirds on the price of just these salaries alone, or 11 Get Outs, or 125 Napoleon Dynamites. The filmmakers also decided to reshoot both the beginning and the ending of the film, which contributed to the high production cost. And a lot of blame was also put on Brooks's slow and meticulous shooting style and post-production process. But Columbia Pictures must have been confident that these names would attract audiences, or why else would they fork over that kind of money? How Do You Know hit theaters on December 17th of 2010, with an opening weekend gross of $7 million. It came in number 8 in the box office behind Tron Legacy, Yogi Bear, The Chronicles of Narnia, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Fighter, Tangled, The Tourist, and Black Swan. Domestically, it would make $30 million, and overseas, it would rake in $18 million for a total worldwide gross of $48 million. And against that budget of $120 million, not even including marketing or distribution, that made this film a certified box office bomb. But it wasn't just a bomb, it was a disaster, and ranks in the top 25 biggest box office flops of all time, with some estimates of its loss being around $100 to $140 million. And that, of course, invites the question of how did this movie crash and burn so hard? It's pretty obvious why this movie bombed. I mean, the $120 million budget was just insane. For comparison, we could look at 3 other rom-coms that came out in the same year or the year after. Life as We Know It made over $100 million on a $38 million budget, Friends with Benefits made $150 million on a $35 million budget, and Crazy Stupid Love made $145 on a $50 million budget. And the crazy thing is, just like How Do You Know, those last 2 had big A-list stars attached. I would also like to blame both the title and the marketing. The title is just downright terrible, as it's hardly catchy at all, doesn't give off the impression of a rom-com, and sounds like a question, but doesn't end in a question mark. It's just odd. From the posters, you get the impression that they were banking on these big stars alone to bring in crowds, but that obviously didn't work. They also didn't do a good job of conveying what the movie was actually about through the trailer, as just like the movie itself, it gets lost in a tangle of subplots. It looked painfully average, and while I can't play it here, the music they used in the trailer sounds like royalty-free stock music. I know I have no room to talk because I use royalty-free music in my videos, but the difference is, my videos don't cost $120 million. They only cost $90 million. But go check the trailer out. It's cheesy as hell and it looks like a fake SNL trailer. Additionally, I don't think James L. Brooks' name had much box office sway in 2010. While he did have the box office hit and Oscar-winning film As Good As It Gets in 1997, a lot of that goodwill from that film had worn out, especially since the only film he dropped in between these was 2004's Spanglish, which was also a box office dud and had a pretty mixed reaction. And as we discussed in the previous section, the movie was totally buried in the box office, only coming in at number 8 on its opening weekend. Now, I don't think there was much overlap in the intended demographics, but I still think it's worth mentioning that the film dropped on the same exact day as Tron Legacy and Yogi Bear, and was up against other big draws such as Narnia and Tangled. Again, not like this was a big factor, but it certainly didn't help. The final nail in the coffin for How Do You Know was the terrible reviews and lack of positive word of mouth. The film currently boasts a 31% critic and 25% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, in addition to a 5.4 out of 10 on IMDb and a 2.3 out of 5 on Letterboxd. This movie would also score James L. Brooks some time in director's jail, as he wouldn't direct another film until 2025's Ella McKay. But the cast would come out mostly unharmed, as they've all had successful careers since. However, this would be Jack Nicholson's last role before his retirement, which is a very unfortunate note to go out on. So now that we've discussed why it failed commercially, let me offer up some thoughts on why it fails as a movie. Alright, before we dig into this movie, let me give a quick recap of the plot, which means spoilers ahead. The movie focuses on Lisa, a professional softball player who has recently been cut from her team for being too old. She has been occasionally seeing a famous professional baseball player named Maddie, who is a bit of a doofus and not really a good boyfriend. At the same time, we are introduced to George, who is the target of a federal criminal investigation for corporate malfeasance at his father's company. He gets fired and his girlfriend breaks up with him, and on a whim, he asks Lisa on a date, and she agrees. However, since Lisa is still seeing Maddie, she doesn't want to commit to George, and they just become friends. Over the course of the movie, Lisa leaves Maddie because he is terrible and hangs out with George, but she won't initiate anything romantic. This cycle continues for what feels like 4 hours until she finally realizes that George is the person she should be with, and they end up together. Oh, and George's dad was the one behind the corporate malfeasance, and he goes to jail. I think if the producers took the $120 million they spent on making this film, put it in a big pile, and set it on fire, it would be far more entertaining than the actual movie. Listen, I'm not a big fan of rom-coms to start with, so this movie was already working at a disadvantage with me. But when I watch a rom-com, at the bare minimum, I want it to be two things: romantic and comedic. And How Do You Know is neither of those things. First, let's discuss the romance. The movie hits the overdone trope of her starting out with the rich famous guy who doesn't treat her well, while pushing away the nice guy who understands her. The thing is, Reese Witherspoon and Paul Rudd have barely any romantic chemistry at all. This is made worse by an awful script which is putting them in the weirdest, most bland situations possible. Literally, their first date together, they yell at each other and then spend the rest of the dinner in silence. And this is supposed to be this big epiphany, where that's how George realizes that this is his dream girl, because she literally told him not to talk during dinner. That's the big epiphany. Not to mention, the dialogue that James L. Brooks has written for these characters is just weird. It has no rhythm to it, and there's always these big weird pauses in the conversations. And this ties into the comedy, as a lot of the time, these pauses are supposed to be awkward for comedic effect. But even the moments where it's supposed to be emotional, it just totally misses. There's too many points where George will make a joke, or he'll try to make a connection with Lisa, and she just looks at him like he's the weirdest guy in the world. The only times I really laughed in this movie all surrounded Owen Wilson's character just being a total idiot. He plays that archetype really well, and his scenes in this movie were the silver lining. As for the rest of the performances, I could not care less. I didn't dig Paul Rudd's performance in this movie, which is a shame because I'm usually a big fan of his. I didn't care for Reese Witherspoon's character either, but that's pretty much due to the horrible writing that James L. Brooks conjured up for her. Jack Nicholson is decent in the few scenes that he's in, although the whole subplot he's in felt like it was stitched into this story from a completely different movie. Speaking of which, we also have to discuss the background of this corporate malfeasance subplot that's going on. It was such an odd choice to center a rom-com around this, because it's so insanely boring. They try to make it this big dramatic plot by having the father be the one who's behind it, and he's trying to blame it on his son. So George has to make the decision to take the fall and go to prison for 3 years, or let his dad take the fall and go to prison for 25 years. And this whole decision on who's going to jail is decided by if Lisa will be with George or not. It is just so odd, and it totally missed the mark with me because I didn't care about it at all. Truly, the only memorable thing about this movie is that it cost more than any of the Lord of the Rings movies or any of the Star Wars prequels. I'm not even joking. Most of the Lord of the Rings movies cost around $95 million, while most of the Star Wars prequels cost around $115 million. How insane is that? I know it seems like I've just been repeating how crazy this movie's budget is, but it's just so bizarre. Alright, I've said enough. It's time to wrap it up. How Do You Know is truly a misfit when stacked among some of the other box office bombs we've come to know and love. It had an insanely high budget for no reason, and failed to bring anyone to the theater despite having some big name stars attached. It's no wonder it's been forgotten about and doesn't even get the status of infamy. But what are your thoughts on the film? Have you seen it? Have you even heard of it? I'd love to know down in the comments. This has been Tom from Isenhart Productions, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next week. And here's a clue for next week's video. But I will say this movie is a little unrealistic. Everyone knows that the true meaning of Christmas is to buy as much useless stuff as possible before you die.